Back to you.
All right, we'll talk about it with the panel. Kevin Corke live with the president in Hawaii. Thank you. The president-elect is not keeping quiet when it comes to his feelings about the current president's foreign policy moves. Donald Trump is weighing in on Twitter and to reporters, but how his reactions can be turned into policy is still in question. Correspondent Peter Doocy has our report tonight from inside Mar-a-Lago. Good evening, Peter.
Good evening, Shannon. In the last 1 minute, we got President-elect Donald Trump's response for the first time to President Obama's announcement about a punishment for Russia for alleged election day interference. And the statement says this: "It's time for our country to move on to bigger and better things. Nevertheless, in the interest of our country and its great people, I will meet with leaders of the intelligence community next week in order to be updated on the facts of this situation." That is consistent with what the president-elect has been saying about this issue here at Mar-a-Lago, but also up in New York during the transition. And it's also consistent with his repeated attempts to completely turn American foreign policy around 180 degrees. The Iran nuclear deal, China's currency manipulation, ISIS, all things candidate Donald Trump talked a lot about, but President-elect Donald Trump hasn't been lately. That's because instead of just crafting policies to address these problems, the next president has been doing a lot of reacting to moves the current one has been making, almost always taking the exact opposite position, like with Russia. The Obama White House punished them for allegedly interfering with the American election, but Mr. Trump, no supporter of sanctions, telling reporters last night he wasn't so sure they were involved.
I think we ought to get on with our lives. I think that computers have complicated lives very greatly. The whole age of computer has made it where nobody knows exactly what's going on.
It's the same split on Israel, which didn't get a ton of attention on the trail from Mr. Trump, but has recently been an issue he's used to hammer his predecessor.
I think Israel's been treated very, very unfairly by a lot of different people. You look at resolutions in the United Nations, you take a look at what's happened. They're up for 20 reprimands, and other nations that are horrible places that treat people horribly haven't even been reprimanded.
Transition officials acknowledge there is just one president at a time, and as they wait to see what kind of moves the 44th makes on his way out of office, they are promising quick reversals of many unpopular policies.
I'm not sure how long it's going to take, but I can tell you that on day one alone, there's going to be an unquestionable demarcation for this administration. Change is coming to Washington, D.C., and I think it's not just going to be the first 100 days. It's going to be the first, hour, the first day, the first week, the first month, the first 100 days, the first year, the first term. It's not going to stop.
It was a relatively quiet day here at Mar-a-Lago until we got that response to the Russia announcement. But transition officials tell us to expect a flurry of activity in the next few days as they fill the 4 remaining cabinet-level positions, all of their deputies, and announce who America's next batch of ambassadors are going to be as well. Shannon.
All right, Peter Doocy live in Florida. Thank you. The fraying relationship between the U.S. and Israel is spreading across Washington and around the world. Many are weighing in and taking sides after Secretary of State John Kerry tried to explain why the U.S. did not veto a UN resolution condemning Israel. Correspondent Rich Edson reports from the State Department tonight on the continued fallout from that UN vote.
A United Nations Security Council resolution condemning Israel's settlement building. It prompted charges from the Israeli government. The Obama administration orchestrated an anti-Israeli condemnation at the UN. An exhaustive denial and explanation yesterday from the Secretary of State, John Kerry. Another response from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And now reaction from Washington to Israel.
We do not teach our children to make Molotov cocktails or throw stones. There's no hate or incitement being taught or educated anywhere in our schools. And that's what we're up against. The
Secretary of State's argument, the possibility of a two-state solution is slipping away. One where Israel lives peacefully next to a Palestinian state. Israel's expanded settlements, Kerry argues, is one of the many impediments jeopardizing that outcome, though he spent most of his speech criticizing those settlements. Among many in the international community, support for Kerry's speech. France's foreign minister called Kerry's address clear, courageous, and committed, and reinforced the necessity and the urgency to implement this two-state solution. Germany and Jordan also offered praise. However, many in the U.S. Congress, even Democrats, have criticized Kerry's address.
It's easy for us to sit and point fingers and say the Israelis should do this, the Israelis should do that. By the way, I didn't hear very much from John Kerry about what the Palestinians need to do.
Right.
But it's easy for us to do it. They are living in a very dangerous area with their derriere on the line.
In a statement, Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman John McCain says, quote, Secretary Kerry's speech today was at best a pointless tirade in the waning days of an outgoing administration. At worst, it was another dangerous outburst that will further Israel's diplomatic isolation and embolden its enemies. And as McCain points out, U.S. foreign policy towards Israel will change dramatically as the Trump administration assumes power, likely making Kerry's speech the final emphatic volley in a relationship defined largely by its animosity. And now the State Department is reacting to some of those criticisms, in particular that from the Senate's incoming minority leader, Chuck Schumer, who says that the administration's actions have emboldened extremists on both sides. To that, a State Department official says stating uncomfortable facts doesn't embolden extremists. Dangerous steps on the ground by both sides do that. Shannon?
From the State Department, Rich Edson, thank you. The U.S. military says it is possible civilians were killed during an airstrike today in Mosul. The military says a coalition strike hit a van loaded with ISIS fighters in what was later determined to be a hospital parking lot. An investigation into the matter is planned. This comes as U.S.-led airstrikes helped Iraqi troops push further into Mosul as the fight to retake the city from ISIS continues there. Smoke rose across the city and explosions and machine gun fire could be heard as forces pushed into several neighborhoods. Today's assault comes after a 2-week lull in the operation and more than 2 months into the offensive to recapture the final ISIS-held city in Iraq. A potential breakthrough tonight in the Syrian civil war that has ravaged the country for 6 years and left hundreds of thousands of people dead. Tonight, a ceasefire throughout the entire country is in effect in an agreement that was reached without the United States. Senior Foreign Affairs correspondent Greg Palcott has the details.
It could be the first ceasefire in the nearly 6-year-long Syrian civil war with even the remotest chance of working. Announced today by Russian President Vladimir Putin, it calls for the Syrian government and many opposition groups to lay down their weapons.
This is a notable result of our joint work, efforts by the defense and foreign ministries, our partners in the region.
Syria announced a nationwide halt in fighting, which has left hundreds of thousands dead and millions displaced in Syria and around the world. Moderate rebels also agreed.
The ceasefire covers the whole of Syria, and no part of it remains apart.
Excluded from the deal and possibly complicating things, ISIS and the Syrian branch of al-Qaeda, both very active. Still, the fact several principal supporters from both sides, including President Tayyip Erdogan's Turkey, which backs the rebels, and the backers of Syria and its President Bashar al-Assad, Russia, and Iran, have agreed to police their corners and halt their offensive activities, including the just-finished fighting in the city of Aleppo, is significant.
The nature of this deal, the people who've actually struck it, I think makes it very distinctive and interesting.
Left out in the cold, the Obama administration, even though it had been very active backing those same moderate rebels, and has been involved in UN-sponsored Syria talks in the past. However, when it comes to a future administration,
I would like to express the hope that when Donald Trump's administration comes on duty, they would also be able to join these efforts.
The president-elect has been supportive of Russia's role in Syria and against Obama's support of the rebels. There was even anti-U.S. sniping from NATO member and U.S. ally Turkey. Amid claims this week the U.S. has been arming ISIS and Kurdish forces in Syria, denied by Washington.
Unfortunately, the coalition forces do not keep their promises.
A message from the State Department called the ceasefire a positive development and hoped through future talks, which would include in part Bashar al-Assad, that the agreement would be implemented and respected, and also admitted that the U.S. was not a part of the negotiations. Shannon.
All right, Greg Palcott, thank you. Joining me now to talk about everything from the economic sanctions placed on Russia to the ceasefire deal reached without U.S. input, John Bolton, former U.S. ambassador to the UN. Good evening. Great to have you with us tonight.
Glad to be with you.
Okay, so let's start with Syria because that's where Greg left off. The U.S. wasn't part of what they've reached now. Russia's foreign minister, though, says once President-elect Trump takes office, he's welcome to take part in these talks. What does that say to you about where we are?
Well, it says, come into my parlor, said the spider to the fly. I've known Sergei Lavrov for 25 years. That's par for the course. I'm not going to hold my breath on this ceasefire. I think this is basically about Putin trying to get closer to Turkey to wean them away from the NATO alliance, which would be a substantial defeat for the United States as Erdogan moves further away from the West in general. I don't think it'll have any substantial effect on the ground in Syria, but I think it shows Russia's continued effort to extend its influence in the region, which it's already done to a point far greater than anything in the 50 years since Anwar Sadat expelled the Soviet advisors from Egypt.
So your best advice to the incoming president with regards to Syria?
Every extension of Russian influence in the Middle East is negative for American national interest, up to and including their new air base at Latakia. And I think finding ways to limit and eventually remove Russian influence in the region, which is already troubled enough for all kinds of reasons, should be the highest priority.
Well, okay, so now we have the complicating factor of these new sanctions today against a number of individuals and organizations, 35 Russian intelligence officials being kicked out of this country, 2 Russian compounds being shut down, and we're told there will be things we don't know about, of course, publicly, maybe cyber operations that happen as well. That's done with the Obama administration leaving in 3 weeks. How does it now set up relations for a Trump administration with Russia?
Well, I think they're all reversible if that's what he wants to do. But what the president announced today was incoherent and inadequate, which is fairly typical of his foreign policy. His first mistake was to muddy 2 different things: the hacking, the attempt to meddle in our elections on the one hand, with the harassment of American diplomats in Moscow on the other, which I don't doubt the Russians are doing, and the expulsion of 35 of their people, undoubtedly intelligence operatives for the most part, is entirely acceptable. But to lump it together now confuses the cyber attack issue. And by the way, with the time difference, we may well wake up tomorrow morning and find that 35 American diplomats have been expelled from Moscow. Very inconvenient at the beginning of a new administration, I might point out. But specifically on the cyber issue, these sanctions are pitifully inadequate. We have frozen the assets of named individuals and organizations in the United States. How many Russian intelligence officials do you think have assets in the United States to begin with? And they won't be able to shop on Fifth Avenue. That's really going to break their hearts. Targeted sanctions are almost always inadequate, and these are. And as for the statement by President Obama that other unspecified actions will be taken in the future, this president has no credibility when it comes to that. Obviously, you're not going to reveal in advance some of the things you're going to do, but it is important not only to retaliate against Russia for this and many other previous cyber attacks, but to do it in a way that deters them from engaging in this activity in the future. And one critical component of that kind of strategy is not just to harm them, but to shame them, to say in public, this is what we have done, and we have the capability to do more. Because it shows that Russia has suffered a penalty for this action, and it tells everybody else in the world, specifically China and others, that they better not think about it either.
So if you think that these sanctions and everything else that was announced today really are somewhat toothless, why now? What is the motivation for this administration? Because Russia has done all kinds of bad activities, whether it's related to Crimea, other hacking or leaking intrusions that we've known about for a long time. Why now as they're walking out the door? What's the point?
Well, it's hard to understand what the point is. If you're worried about the vulnerability of the United States, and specifically the U.S. government, to foreign cyber intrusions, again, whether it's Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, you name it, this should have been a policy going back, let's just say roughly 8 years, to begin to create both offensive and defensive capabilities that lead to structures of deterrence. I'm not interested in endless back and forth over this kind of activity. I want it clear to the Russians, the Chinese, and others that they simply shouldn't engage in it, because if they do, they will pay a price far greater than whatever pain they inflict on us. This is a new world, but it's a world that we're going to have to live in, and just as we use positions of strength to deter hostile activity in more conventional military areas, we need to do it here as well. This is not a law enforcement problem. This is not a problem that's going to be solved by another executive order. This is going to be solved by inflicting sufficient pain on the aggressor that they don't do it in the future.
I want to make sure that I ask you before you go about the UN vote, our abstention, our refusal to veto something that we could have with regard to Israeli settlements. The Prime Minister says there is evidence the U.S. actively promoted this resolution. He says there's evidence he's going to share with the new administration. Secretary Kerry and others at the State Department have continuously denied that they drafted or recruited folks to put this resolution forward. There's a lot of wiggle room in the language, but so far a lot of denials from this administration.
Well, I don't trust the denials at all, and I suspect that what the Israelis have is intercepts of communications by other Security Council members, not the United States communication, but other countries reporting on their discussions with U.S. diplomats up to and including John Kerry. And I certainly hope, without harming anybody's sources and methods of intelligence, they can be made public. Look, I don't know whether the U.S. led this effort, but the State Department, John Kerry, Barack Obama were witting in it from the beginning. This has been talked about for close to 2 years, what Obama might do in the period between our election and our inauguration. And in the last 6 months, people have written about it. People have speculated what this resolution would look like. There was no doubt the United States saw text of this resolution and signaled at the appropriate point, if that's the draft you go with, we will not veto. And that's when it happened.
It sure did. All right. Ambassador, great to see you. Thanks for joining us tonight. Up next, tempers flare over the administration's announcement of 2 new national monuments. First, though, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 10 in Phoenix, where the state Supreme Court is set to decide whether hundreds of thousands of Arizona workers will get a boost in their pay in the new year. The voter-approved measure would raise the minimum wage from just over $8 an hour to $10 on January 1st. But several groups are asking the court to block the increase, citing the lack of a new funding source as required by the state constitution. A decision is expected by the end of the week. Fox 26 in Houston, where 2 National Guard soldiers died after their Apache helicopter crashed into the water during a routine training flight on Wednesday. Military officials identify the men tonight as 32-year-old Dustin Mortensen and 33-year-old Lucas Lowe. They say both soldiers were highly trained professionals and express their sympathies to the victims' families. And this is a live look at Boston from Fox 25. The big story there tonight, the Republican governor weighing a 6-month delay of key provisions in the state's voter-approved recreational marijuana law. The measure would likely mean a delay in the opening of retail pot shops in the state until mid-2018 instead of January of that year as originally planned. It would not affect provisions already in effect, including possession and use of limited amounts of marijuana. President Obama has made yet another move trying to cement his legacy as an environmentalist. But some are decrying the president's actions, believing the steps within days of leaving office show he's trying to bind the hands of President-elect Trump. Correspondent Doug McKelway reports tonight on the controversy over the president's legacy grab.
With the designation of 2 huge Western landmasses as new national monuments, President Obama has offered a vast parting gift to environmentalists and a parting shot at political rivals.
It's devastating. It's such an arrogant land grab. The size is bigger than the state of Delaware, and the president just unilaterally came in and grabbed more than 1.35 million acres.
That 1.35 million acres in Utah will now be called the Bears Ears National Monument. The second area in Nevada will become the Gold Butte National Monument, spanning 300,000 acres. The White House says the designation will protect, quote, sacred sites, spectacular scenery, and important natural and cultural resources in desert landscapes. Senate Leader Harry Reid said of the Nevada designation, quote, I was overjoyed to hear the news today. Utah's governor was not.
How else do you look at it in Utah other than in the punishment of the people of Utah when we are so overwhelmingly opposed to it?
It's not just Utah's governor, but that state's entire congressional delegation and all local elected officials who oppose the designation. The administration claims many Native Americans support the move.
There have been some instances where some of these sacred sites were desecrated and destroyed.
We are our own government, and we have the right to speak over our ancestral lands.
But support from Native Americans is deeply disputed.
When I met with the president of the Navajo Nation about a year and a half ago, he didn't even know where Bears Ears was.
Critics half-jokingly contend neither does the president. In a tweet touting the designation, the White House used the wrong picture of Arches National Park. It prompted Utah Senator Orrin Hatch to tweet back, "If you're going to take 1.3 million acres of Utah land, at least use the right photo."
As with hundreds of other unilateral moves by the present administration, the new Congress hopes to enlist the support of the new president to undo this one. Shannon, back to you.
Thank you, Doug. The Dow dropped 14. The S&P 500 lost a fraction today. NASDAQ was down 6. The United States has established itself as the strongest military in the world, but now some say more must be done to keep it that way. Pentagon producer Lucas Tomlinson reports tonight on what the Air Force reports it must get in order to keep up with global demand.
Earlier this year, top Air Force officials sounded the alarm, saying they were 700 pilots and 4,000 mechanics short. Now they warn the problem is worse. The Air Force Chief of Staff now says he needs 30,000 airmen. In a statement, General David Goldfein said, quote, "The shortage of people has fundamentally changed the way we do business in terms of the operational risk day to day." The former head of Air Force Intelligence says it's not just the airmen needing a boost.
We have a geriatric Air Force. We've got bombers and tankers that are over 50 years old. We have trainers that are over 40 years old. And we have fighters and helicopters that are over 30 years old. So this is a terrible situation to be placed in when we have a world of ever-expanding threats.
Air Force officials say they need more forces to bolster nuclear, intelligence, space, and maintenance jobs. Earlier this year, General Goldfein called the pilot shortage alone a crisis.
Here's the reason I believe it's a crisis. Air superiority is not an American birthright. It's actually something you have to fight for and maintain.
Your Air Force has been at war since Desert Shield, Desert Storm. This wing has been at war since that time for 25 years. We went to the Middle East when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and we never left.
At the start of the Gulf War, the Air Force had 134 fighter squadrons. Over the past few decades, that number has been cut to 55. Yet the Air Force is conducting nearly 70% of the strike missions against ISIS and 90% of the mid-air refueling missions. The Air Force is not the only service that wants to grow. The Navy says it wants to increase its fleet by 30% as threats around the world intensify. Today, the Navy has 273 ships and submarines. A new Navy study says it needs 355 in the future. The vanguard of that growth is in more attack submarines, like this Los Angeles-class boat seen here in Pearl Harbor, needed to counter what top Navy officials in the Pacific say is a growing Chinese threat. The Army and Marine Corps have both expressed a desire to grow and get badly needed spare parts for their equipment. Shannon?
Lucas Tomlinson at the Pentagon, thank you. Most of us give to charity in hopes of making a difference for a particular cause. But in some cases, your donation may never even reach the people you thought it would. Correspondent William Lajeunesse reports from Los Angeles tonight on the problems with using a third party to help fundraise.
American households, on average, donate $3,000 a year to charity. Regulators say about half doesn't go to charity, however, but rather to the professional fundraisers and telemarketers they hire.
There's many cases where there's a fundraising contract where 85 to 90% of the money is going to the professional fundraising company.
To test that, we examined California's Registry of Charitable Trusts, a list of most national campaigns. In many cases, charities raised thousands but got little back, and some actually lost money. Example, 2 campaigns in 2014 for the Covenant House raised a combined $66,000, but the charity got billed for a total of $209,000. In a statement, the Covenant House said it used the telemarketer to convert current donors to ongoing monthly donors, but ended the program this year. In 2015, the Environmental Defense Fund ran 7 campaigns. 2 made nothing and 4 lost money, costing it tens of thousands. In a statement, the EDF said the campaigns were designed to attract new supporters, not raise funds. They're not alone. In 2015, 24% of charities in mostly national campaigns took home less than 20 cents on the dollar, and 21% lost money altogether.
At Charity Watch, we think it should cost them more than $35 to raise $100. That's our standard for reasonableness.
But that's a high bar. Over the last 3 years, almost 80% of U.S. charities failed to keep at least 65% of their donations. But it's legal. As the U.S. Supreme Court ruled, states cannot regulate how much money a charity keeps. The bottom line experts say don't give to charities you don't know, don't be fooled by familiar names, don't be pressured, don't give cash, don't give money over the phone, and if you give, Shannon, give directly to a charity you know.
Good advice, William. Thanks. Actress Debbie Reynolds died Wednesday, just one day after the death of her daughter, Carrie Fisher. The movie icon was probably best known for her role alongside Gene Kelly in Singin' in the Rain. Reynolds' son Tom says the actress began experiencing breathing problems Wednesday as they were discussing funeral arrangements for Fisher. Todd says that in the moments before she fell ill, she said, "I want to be with Carrie." Reynolds was 84. Coming up, the Obama administration hits Russia with sanctions over election interference. Is it too little too late? Our all-star panel weighs in.
Our bottom line is that what Russia's been engaged in over the last few months and years is unacceptable. It's outside the norms of diplomatic behavior, and the president is sending a message today to tell them to cut it out.
All right, that is Eric Schultz from the White House press team. Let's bring in our panel to talk about those sanctions that came out today. Steve Hayes, editor-in-chief of the Weekly Standard. Karen Tumulty, national political correspondent for The Washington Post. Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. Welcome to you all. Steve, what do you make of this? Because my inbox was immediately filled up with reaction from Capitol Hill, both sides of the aisle, mostly from Republicans saying, we're glad to see it, but why are we 8 years into the presidency and just now getting these?
Yeah, it's a very good question. First, I think we should make a point of clarification. This was not a hack of our electoral system.
Correct. No votes were hacked. No one's making that allegation.
The White House senior administration officials on the White House call today said that, acknowledged that, made that clear. Russia did not hack the voting system. Having said that, what the White House tried to say on the call today was that a series of bad behavior really over years from Russia, both with respect to diplomatic activities and this hacking of democratic entities, led them to do this. It's not a very convincing turn for President Obama to present himself as a new hawk on Russia. This is the president who had accommodated Russia, I would argue, for 7.5 years, starting with the reset, going on to what he allowed the Russians to get away with in Syria, looking at Ukraine, where we were going to isolate Russia for its incursions into the Crimean Peninsula. We offered them repeated diplomatic off-ramps, remember that term, that they did not take. And now you have the president acting tough. Well, I guess it's nice that the president's finally acting tough to Vladimir Putin, who's been, I think, threatening our interests and aggressively expanding his reach for years. But it's too little too late.
But on this particular question, which is the hacking, he is more of a hawk than the incoming president. And I think that these sanctions are in part an effort to continue to isolate Donald Trump, who has expressed, doubt that in fact Russia did this, and also to sort of box him in, because it is difficult to imagine, but not impossible to imagine, that he would want to roll back any of these sanctions. The president-elect issued a statement just a few moments ago saying we need to move on, repeating yesterday's, but also saying that he will be meeting with intelligence officials to talk about just exactly what they know. That is moving him.
But can I just say, just to jump in real quick, think about what you just said. The President of the United States is moving to isolate Donald Trump.
The new president.
I mean, not Vladimir Putin for 7.5 years, but isolating his successor. I mean, that is an incredible thing to say. And I agree with the criticism of Donald Trump that he should be more concerned about Vladimir Putin, to be sure. But that's an incredible thing if the President of the United States is moving to isolate his successor.
Well, let me read you, first of all, real quick, let me just read you the full statement from Donald Trump. President-elect, he says, it's time for our country to move on to bigger and better things. Nevertheless, in the interest of our country and its great people, I will meet with leaders of the intelligence community next week in order to be updated on the facts of this situation. And Molly, they laid out a lot of facts today, the DHS and FBI together, tracking what they show. They say shows the exact links to Russian intelligence getting involved, whether they were leaking or hacking. There are different definitions there, but doing things that were intended to influence voters in this country going into the presidential election?
Well, they did release a report, and it more asserts that Russia was involved as opposed to lays out exactly how Russia is involved. So it is, I think people are still waiting for good information to know exactly how Russia was involved, exactly what the nature of the meddling was. Clearly, people want to give the impression that this was an election hack or a hacking of the voting, as opposed to ongoing Russian meddling.
And leaking information that may have been unsavory for Democrats or for John Podesta, chairman of the Hillary Clinton campaign.
And, you know, during this administration, we had the hacking of OPM by Chinese people, where the information of more than 22 million Americans was released. Very sensitive personal information, opening people up to blackmail. That was not treated as a 5-alarm fire like this is. And so it's important that we get a little bit of perspective. We should be dealing with all of our cybersecurity threats, not just the ones that set people off because of how it relates to Trump and Putin.
How does this set up the Putin-Trump relationship now, Charles?
Well, I think it's a mistake for Trump to try to keep downplaying this. It doesn't help him. It makes him look defensive. It's not going to have any effect on the outcome. Once there's a change in presidencies, this is not going to be a major issue. The sanctions are so ridiculously small and tit for tat. You can be sure the Russians are going to expel an equal number of Americans. I've been told that one of the safe houses are going to be shutting down in Virginia was shut down by Reagan 30 years ago, and it reopened. These are revolving door stuff. This is sort of Mad Magazine spy versus spy and not much more. And the timing is ridiculous. If you're going to do this, you do it when it happens. You don't say to Vladimir Putin during an election, cut it out. I mean, this is adolescent. You say there'll be consequences and you make them stick. So I think it's a fairly trivial affair. Look, the Russians, they stole our mail, they read our mail, they published our mail. That's called espionage. You're not supposed to do that. You do it, we punish you. That should have been done 18 months ago. You send a signal to the Chinese, the Iranians, and others. We will punish you. This is a slap on the wrist. It will pass, and there's no reason for Trump to downplay it. I think he thinks it impugns his legitimacy. Some Democrats would like people to think that, but I think he's really overplaying the significance. Let it go.
How does this factor then into the conversation that Rex Tillerson, the nominee to be Secretary of State, is likely to face now in the Senate when he goes up there to defend himself and talk about why he's the right guy? Steve, he's been known for lobbying against sanctions, saying they're often not effective. They've affected work he's done as the head of Exxon with regard to drilling and projects in Russia. How will this factor in now to that conversation?
Well, I think he should face tough questions about both his own personal experience with Vladimir Putin, having received this Friend of Putin, or Friend of the Russian People Award in 2013. And also Mike Pompeo will receive, no doubt, difficult questions, challenging questions on these subjects. It's important, I think, to point out that the Obama administration, it's not just that they have sort of been accommodating the Russians on this stuff. Republicans in Congress have been pushing the Obama administration consistently for 7.5 years to take further steps. Tom Cotton and others tried to insert language into the Intel Authorization Act that would have just sought to enforce existing rules about how diplomats from Russia travel around the country. They're not allowed to travel more than 25 miles from diplomatic outposts without seeking permission or notifying the State Department. The Obama administration refused to enforce existing rules and pushed back hard on Republicans in Congress, trying to push them to do so, suggesting that the Russians would find this action provocative if we merely enforced our rules. So I think it's important that we understand the context for this new toughness from President Obama.
Well, and Karen, with respect to what Senator Cotton had proposed, apparently there's a letter that came in response. I don't think it's ever been public, but essentially said, we don't need what you're suggesting. And it was all about pushing back against Russian interference, saying we have methods and things in place and this is unnecessary. So there was a push from the Hill to do more.
And this, by the way, is also an opportunity for Donald Trump to sort of pivot, as he says, to move on past this, to frame it in a broader context. That might be an opportunity, since there's Republican support for that on the Hill.
Molly, final word to you.
It's just funny that 4 years ago we had people making fun of Mitt Romney for saying that Russia was a huge geopolitical threat, and I think it was Obama or the DNC that said the 80s called, they want their foreign policy back. It feels like we're right back in the 80s right now.
Well, and with Syria and so many other things in play, that relationship with Russia is going to be front and center when Inauguration Day comes. All right, Charles, you're up first next time, so stick around. Don't go anywhere. Next up, a monumental decision that has a lot of people questioning the president's.
There are parts that are worth preserving, but 1.35 million acres, bigger than the state of Delaware? Are you kidding me? It's one of the biggest land grabs in the history of the United States, and it was done, this midnight monument, in the waning hours of the Obama administration. I just hope and pray that Donald Trump, the president-elect himself, on day one will take this thing down. It's just so fundamentally flawed at every level.
We are back with our panel to talk about a couple of national monument designations the president made. And Utah officials and others out west have been negotiating over this for years and have been warning and asking the president not to do it on his way out. 1.35 million acres in one, and the other one, I believe, is around 300,000 acres. And a little bit of a development today that when I think it was the White House tweeted out about it, they used the wrong picture. And that got some blowback, not only from Congressman Chaffetz there, but others. Chaffetz said something to the effect of, White House pick is arches, not monuments. Couldn't find a pic of bear's ears and doesn't even know where it is. Hashtag worst president ever. Charles, they're not happy in Utah tonight.
Well, look, you have to ask yourself, if this is such a great idea, then why didn't he just nationalize all of Nevada and all of Utah? It would have been an even stronger, a better idea. Look, this is a president acting. There's now half a dozen things in a unilateral way at the end of a presidency when he's no longer accountable. This is about as anti-democratic as you can get. You were in office for 8 years. You ran twice. You got your mandates. And on all of these issues, you could go back to the settlement vote. You can go back to the Arctic, shutting the Arctic and the Atlantic, Guantanamo, releasing the next to last handful. He's doing all these things that have been explicitly rejected by his own party, and that he doesn't have the courage of his own convictions, getting them done to lock in his successor. It's very anti-democratic. I don't know about the merits of the case. I would imagine that allowing mixed use and some exploration would be a good thing for the country. But Obama sees himself as the god hovering over the country, dispensing goodies to the extent that he's got control. And he figures, I've got control here, no one can stop me. And maybe it'll be somewhat irreversible.
Well, and Molly, as we talked about, I mean, lawmakers out west have been signaling trouble for years, have been saying they worry because as soon as these designations are made, then the federal government controls this land, and they don't. They worry about lack of energy exploration or lack of control as the state over any of these millions of acres. I want to, though, put up what the president said in talking about this. He said, following years of public input and various proposals to protect both of these areas, including legislation and a proposal from tribal governments in and around Utah, these monuments will protect places that a wide range of stakeholders all agree are worthy of protection. We also have worked to ensure that tribes and local communities can continue to access and benefit from these lands for generations to come. Lawmakers are telling a different story.
Well, there is a context here which I think is very important for people who don't live out west to understand, which is the federal government controls more than 25% of all land, it controls more than 50% of all land west of the Rockies, and it controls 85% of the land in Nevada. I mean, this is something that people out east just don't understand how much the federal government controls these parts. And they always say that they're going to be very careful to make sure that local use applies and that people can have input into these matters. But that's different from the reality. There are rebellions going back many decades of local people rebelling against how the federal government wants to allow land to be used, and it can sometimes erupt into violence. I mean, this is actually related to the issue that we saw out in Oregon, in the very remote part of Oregon, where some people seized a federal facility after the federal government they were letting people use federal land, and when local people burned some sagebrush on there to deal with some invasive species and to do some fire control because the federal government wasn't doing it, they get in trouble, and it leads to this big standoff that we saw where people died and there were big trials and whatnot. This is a huge issue, and just because people are consulted doesn't mean that everyone's going to be happy, but there is no theory of constitutional governance that empowers one man to just unilaterally take this land without so much as a congressional vote.
Although the question of whether it's reversible, which which Congressman Chaffetz raised and Charles also raised, that's really questionable because he is using this executive power under something called the Antiquities Act. He's used it 29 times so far, more than any president other than Franklin D. Roosevelt. And it may use it a couple more times before the inauguration. There are court decisions that suggest that while the president has the power to designate monuments under this act, they may not have the power to undesignate monuments under it. So once done, this may very well be and probably is permanent.
And Steve, we have Senator Lee also talking about trying to undo it, and this won't stand, obviously exploring his options.
Yeah, I think Senator Lee and others are optimistic that if it can't be undone entirely, and it might be able to be, that at least it can be narrowed. There's precedent, legal precedent for narrowing the scope of the taking. What's interesting is the Antiquities Act, 1906, was originally intended to sort of protect historical or archaeological sites from imminent destruction. That's why this president was given this broad power, and it's been so abused, it's basically become something that environmentalists can use to urge the president, usually a Democratic president, to make these colossal land grabs in order to circumvent Congress, who has the power actually to protect these things. So I think looking forward from this, one of the things that might result of this, certainly I think the Trump administration will seek to narrow, at the very least, how much land has been taken. Depending on who you talk to, you could protect Bears Ears with several hundred acres, not 1.3 million acres. Certainly they'll try to narrow it. They might try to undo this, but I think it's raised the profile of this Antiquities Act in such a way that a Republican Congress with a Republican president will certainly be looking to prevent future presidents from doing these kinds of land confiscations.
Well, and Charles, I believe it was the Utah Attorney General who's already said they're planning a lawsuit, so maybe that's how this Antiquities Act is initially challenged.
And it reminds you of what the attorneys general have done in the case of the EPA with the land grab, the waters of the United States rule, where essentially the feds are taking control of a pond left behind by a rainfall. And what it does is this kind of liberal overreach, starting with EPA, Obamacare, you can look anywhere you want. It's created a backlash that has now been growing. And I think in the end it can undo more than just what Obama did. I think it can sort of roll back the loopholes that have been used by liberals, environmentalists, and others to get outcomes that were never intended in legislation and that have been sort of seized by the executive. I think that this could be a real opportunity to undo a lot of the damage, not just done in the Obama years, but for the last 50, 100 years.
Well, and certainly we know that there was pressure by environmentalists for the president to deliver more, and they've expressed some disappointment that he hasn't done more during this presidency, so maybe a parting gift.
The Arctic Ocean is a pretty large body. This is not trivial.
No.
Bigger than a bear's ears.
Well, and we understand there may be more to come before he is done, so we'll stand by and see. All right, coming up. A teenager tries out her basketball skills on the streets of New York, and it goes viral, but maybe not for the reason she might have hoped. Stick around. Finally tonight, you never know what you'll encounter on the streets of New York. And as one teenager found, if you're adventurous, a moment in your life could actually go viral. Check this out. Sorry, 15-year-old Jillian Turner says she was eating pizza with her cousin when she saw 4'5" street baller Jamani Swanson, a.k.a. Monty Fresh, facing off with unsuspecting New Yorkers caught off guard by his basketball skills. Well, the TV crew asked if she wanted to get in on the action. She agreed, said she felt pretty good about her own basketball skills. She never planned to take a tumble for the whole world to see. She says that fall was legit. I believe her. And now she is just embracing the viral fallout. As we all should when things like that happen. You never know when you're going to get schooled by someone. It's sort of like hustled by a pool player, right? Monty Fresh is the real deal. Thank you for inviting us into your home tonight. That is it for Special Report. Tucker Carlson Tonight starts next.
Good evening. I'm Ed Henry in tonight again for Tucker Carlson, and sometimes you just